Okay, hi everyone, and hi everyone online. So I'm Natasha Rossi. I'm a member of Animal Behavior Live. I'm the co-founder and lead organizer of the Roundtable series. And I was awarded a Symes fund from the University of Sussex to fund this year a series of Roundtable, which will be on the publishing system in academia. So this is the first Roundtable of the series on publication metrics and how to make your research open access. So I'm pleased to welcome Maggie Symes and Nesbit, who are working at the Library of the University of Sussex and who will be presenting publication metrics, alternative metrics, and open access tools today. For you, because I guess you don't know what Animal Behavior Live is, it's an association that we created during the pandemic for researchers working in animal behavior that aims at gathering the community when we could not during the pandemic. So we organize annual online conferences, monthly webinars, and roundtables. And everything is free. The idea is to really emphasize inclusivity and access and make it sustainable as much as we can. That's the idea. All right, I'll leave it to you, Maggie. You have the slides. Thank you.
Well, hello everybody and welcome. So my name is Maggie Symes and I am the Research and Open Scholarship Librarian based in the library here at the University of Sussex. So the first part of this presentation, I'm going to look at publication metrics. So we're going to look at the ideas, what are publication metrics? What are the main metrics relating to articles, authors and journals? Some examples of their uses, and then also some examples of limitations to that use. We're going to look at if there's an alternative way to assess kind of research impact, and then also kind of touch on the end of how publication metrics can be used kind of responsibly. So having thought about these different metrics and their application, what is a responsible way of kind of using those? Okay, so what are publication metrics? Publication metrics are quantitative methods which are used to evaluate published research outputs. They're normally based on citation counts, and that's known as publication metrics or bibliometrics. And they, by analysing research based on these citation counts and the patterns of those counts, they allow us to answer questions such as the number of publications written by an author, how many citations that publication received, how does that compare to similar researchers or papers, and how many highly cited articles does a specific journal publish. The main providers of citation-based metrics are Web of Science, Google Scholar, and Scopus, and their focus is very much on the sharing of research outputs within the academic journal, within the academic community, so they look at academic journals. In contrast, alternative metrics focus on a wider reach and attempt to demonstrate engagement and impact beyond the academic community. And so they look at kind of author collaborations and online activity. And so they allow us to answer questions such as how many people does an author collaborate with, where are those co-authors based kind of geographically, and also is that collaboration with an academic or a non-academic institution. There are also how many times your work has been mentioned in the kind of non-academic literature. So alternative metrics are an indication of the wider impact of outputs, tracking their use in kind of policy documents, news items, social media, blogs, patent citations, and many alternative metrics will focus on online activity to see how research is being kind of shared and discussed. Okay, so we're going to first look at article level metrics. So article level metrics work on the basic premise that the more a work has been cited, the more impact and influential it must be. So they look at, the number of times an article or book or another research has been cited, and kind of build on that kind of premise. More citations equals kind of more important or more impactful. However, in some circumstances this might be true, but how do you account for? Citation counts will vary from one source to another. So this is an article written by an author here at Sussex, and you can see if you just take the numerical value, then that numerical value varies depending on which source it is that you are kind of pulling those kind of citations from. So maybe not something that you can kind of take and you can use without understanding the kind of the context and the source of that number. Data sources that are pulling together these citations often don't include non-journals. So any often citations in books are not counted in those kind of when you're pulling those citations together. For some fields this might not be an issue, but for other fields like kind of more humanities, then that may be an issue if you're not kind of recognising where some of that material is being referred to and being cited. What about negative citations or citations to retracted articles? The types of citations that an article receives is important to establish the quality of the study and to characterise how current research is then building on that prior work. So, for example, are papers being cited to point out their merits, or they're being cited to point out flaws? So are the citations supporting, contrasting, or merely just mentioning the previous work? So understanding that kind of context of how that citation is being used. Consider the issue of ongoing citations to retracted articles. There are some very highly cited articles which are retracted articles, some of which continue to receive citations after being retracted. And so this is a screenshot here from the Citation Retraction Watch database. And they kind of monitor the retracted articles, and you can see here the number of citations continues to grow, even though that article has actually kind of been retracted. So it's important to understand the kind of the context of any citation. What about citation practice between disciplines? So, for example, you couldn't compare the field of oncology with the field of theatre studies. It's a very different kind of practices. So just again, kind of thinking about that kind of the context of the citation. Be cautious of using that numerical value without understanding more about the context. So is there a way to kind of benchmark this? So to kind of even this out a bit? Scopus has generated a publication metric called the Field Weighted Citation Impact Indicator, which shows how well an article has been cited when compared to similar articles. So this is an article here, and I'll kind of keep coming back to that and use it in my examples. So this Field Weighted Citation Index, a score greater than 1 means that the article has been cited more than expected according to the average for that particular discipline. So then that allows you now to kind of to see how that article is being used within the context of the citation and kind of writing kind of behaviour within that discipline. So this takes into account the year of publication, the document type, and like I say, behaviour within that discipline. So by using this figure, that's possibly a fuller way of evaluating the impact of an individual research paper. Okay, so moving on to think about authors. So another group of publication metrics focus on the author, and these look to explore the impact of an author or a group of authors, and again it's based on the citation rates of their publications. Examples of this group of publication metrics include the H-index, a metric called the M-quotient, which I can never pronounce, and a discipline H-index. You may be familiar with the H-index. So the H-index is a single number criteria to evaluate an author's output. It measures the author's impact based on the citation rates of their outputs and is worked by ranking the researcher's papers in descending orders of how many times it's been cited, and the value of H is equal to the number of papers in that list that have the same number of citations. It's a snapshot in time, and the numerical value of an author's H index will change over time as they publish more, and those publications are cited more by others. So while it's very commonly encountered, it's potentially very misleading, and we do not recommend using it in most circumstances. The value of an author's H index should never be used to directly compare individuals, and we'll kind of look at some of those reasons why in a minute. The M quotient aims to address the issues of an H index bias, the H index bias against early career researchers, and is calculated by dividing the H index by the number of research active years. So this is helping to kind of provide that balance by looking at what someone's kind of career length is. And the discipline H index obviously looks at kind of behaviour kind of within a particular discipline. However, how do you account for career length? The value of an H index will be highly dependent on the duration of an individual's career. Established and probably therefore kind of older researchers will tend to have a higher H index due to accumulation of citations over a period of time. This is why I said you must kind of make sure that you don't use an H index to compare kind of individuals, because early career researchers will by definition have a lower value. The M quotient, by looking at the number of years kind of research active, will not take into account individuals who've taken career breaks for whatever kind of reason, because it will take that figure from the date of your first kind of research paper. Subject fields behaviour again, so we kind of touched on again, there is different kind of citation practices kind of within different fields. Disciplines vary in terms of citation practice, publication rates, and the impact of individual kind of papers. So again, that won't kind of come up in an author level metrics. It ignores low citations or zero cited papers, which also may contain valuable contributions, and what about few articles with many citations, or one article with a few citations. So it doesn't kind of allow you to kind of take into account either those two practices. It also comes up with a different value depending on the source. So this is an author kind of here at Sussex, and you can see by kind of the different aggregating kind of databases, so Scopus, Web of Science, and Google Scholar, because they are pulling their citation rates from a range of different kind of sources. The H index value is going to vary. Is there a focus with the H index on quantity kind of over kind of quality? So just to kind of reiterate, we kind of do recommend that the H index should not be directly used to compare individuals. Okay, so now I'm going to move on and talk about journal metrics. So journal level metrics measure, compare, and often rank research journals and scholarly publications. They're quantitative tools for evaluating the relative importance of a journal over a set period of time, and that's usually kind of 3 or 5 years. Journal level metrics should be used as a support to the expert judgment of you and your kind of colleagues when looking for a venue to publish in. They should be never used just as a kind of a standalone. You know the papers, you know the disciplines, you know the journals, you know the editorial boards. That journal level metrics should be used alongside that knowledge. They should not be used to assess the quality or impact of an article or the author, as they place the focus on the venue of publication rather than the quality of the output. Most common journal metric sources are the very well-known journal impact factor, as provided by the journal citation reports from the publisher Clarivate, and site score, and I never know how you pronounce this, Schmargo journal rank from Scopus. And then also Google Scholar will also provide journal level metrics. The journal impact factor is a quantitative tool for evaluating the relative importance of a journal, and it's a measure of the frequency with which published papers are cited up to 2 years after publication. Cite score, so from an alternative source, measures average citations received per document published in a serial over a period of 3 years. So again, they're not directly comparable because they're looking at different time frames. And the Schmago journal rank measures weighted citations received by the serial, and this particular metric applies a weighting depending on the subject field, and then also depending on the prestige of the citing journal. So it's adding that other level of kind of weighting into its ranking. Google Scholar also lists ranked publications by subject category, but that's based on the H index of the article. Google Scholar, when you look at their description of how their metrics are kind of compiled, they do not include smaller publications. So they will only include journals which publish, I think it was more than 100 articles over, I think it was a 5-year kind of time frame. So they don't include at all in their metrics any smaller publications. However, focus is placed on the venue of the publication, not the quality of the individual output. Again, we come back to disciplinary differences. There are also within different disciplines, there will be kind of ranking. So I know that it's the Chartered Association of Business Schools, they will kind of rank journals within their kind of discipline and apply a kind of a star to them. So there are, again, disciplinary differences. What about interdisciplinary journals? So journals that don't fit within one particular kind of discipline, and how are new and emerging fields of research accommodated within this? That's an example there of the aggregate kind of impact factors between different disciplines. So you can see there how detrimental it would be if you just took the figures without understanding the broader kind of context. Is it possible to benchmark? So Scopus have a source normalized impact per paper metric, which normalizes the different levels of citations kind of within that kind of particular discipline. So you can see here, this is an extract from published from the PLOS one, and they include on there this 1.253 source normalized impact paper. So a way of kind of balancing that out between the different kind of disciplines and taking that into account. Okay, so we're going to move on. So in summary, metrics based on, so we've kind of hopefully I've kind of highlighted some of the aspects that metrics that are based on citation and article counts don't routinely take into consideration. The best way to evaluate someone's work is of course to read it. But in terms of metrics, how much someone has published could give you an idea of their productivity and their networks, and the amount the work has been cited could arguably give you an idea of how much that work is valued. However, as we've seen, there are several drawbacks of using citation or article counts as a metric. It's not fair to compare. We've already talked about different disciplines, have different citation expectations, but equally someone who's been writing for 20 years will have been cited just more often than someone who's beginning their career. In addition, the type of article, if an author's published many review articles, they're likely to have higher citations, and there is evidence to suggest that authors who collaborate a lot will be more highly cited, as their collaborative papers will have a wider network. So much to consider and take into account. Is there a way of going beyond citations? So how else could we demonstrate engagement and influence? So for articles, maybe consider page views and downloads. Most publishers offer these on their websites, and they can be used to demonstrate interest in your article immediately after publication and over a period of time. You're not waiting for someone to cite it. You can see there the kind of the page views and then the kind of downloads, which may be an indicator of kind of an active engagement with your with your paper. Maybe further explore an author's publication profile. Who have they collaborated with on publications? Which journals are they publishing in, and where are those citations coming from? So using platforms like Google Scholar and Scopus and SciVal and Web of Science, you can start to build up a picture of an individual kind of author that is going beyond just their citations. Okay, so how else could we go beyond citations to demonstrate interest in and engagement with research papers? So the field of alternative metrics provides a different measure of how scholarly publications are shared, used and discussed online. They can give an indication of the influence and engagement of a publication in online newspapers and news services, blogs, citations in Wikipedia articles, sharing via social media networks, use in reference management platforms, and inclusion in policy documents. So they can be an important tool to help understand the context surrounding a research output. They can present a live picture of how research is being shared and discussed, and will indicate engagement both within the academic community and engagement and reach with kind of practitioners, policymakers, and members of the public. And it's a much more immediate, you're not waiting for citations. The two main providers of alternative metrics are Altmetrics and PlumX. You may have seen this colourful icon before. So this is known as the altmetric donut, and this provides a visual indicator of engagements with a paper. So using the same article where we looked at earlier, where we looked at its kind of citations within Scopus, we can now see a kind of a bigger picture of engagement and influence of that article. Here, Altmetrics is tracking engagement across a number of different platforms to capture kind of interest and discussion about this particular article. And we can see there that we've got, so it collates online mentions and shares the research across a range of sources for articles that have a DOI. Those sources are mentioned in the coloured donut, and the colours represent different sources. Each source is assigned a weight, and so that does mean that kind of a news article would be more heavily weighted than a tweet. So what is useful as well is you can see at a glance how an article is being picked up and linked through to those mentions. You can see if your work is being picked up by practitioners, or as I've kind of demonstrated here, geographically in an area that you might not have expected. This may lead to help with kind of future projects and collaborations. This one here, you can see as well, you have a demographic breakdown of who is engaging with that particular research. Altmetrics captures information both at article level and then pulls that together via a Altmetrics for institutions at author level as well. And here at Sussex we have that, so you can look at author level or article. As people interact with research, they leave online footprints, and Plum Analytics gathers these footprints and creates and categorises metrics on individual pieces of research, so articles, conference proceedings, book chapters, and more. And this is the same article that we were looking at earlier, but this is its metrics according to the kind of the PlumX as well. So this one will also look at things like references in kind of Wikipedia and policy as well. So an indicator of where maybe kind of practitioners are kind of picking up on research outputs. Okay, so just finally, thinking about using kind of research metrics or publication metrics responsibly. So the University of Sussex is a signatory to what's known as DORA, which is the Declaration on Research Assessment, and this is a kind of a paper which outlines recommendations on how to approve research assessments. And then you can see there's kind of 3 statements. So the institution is committed to being explicit about the criteria which is used to evaluate research activity. Importantly, to recognise the value of all relevant research outputs, so that's publications, data sets, practice-based outputs, software, training, and impact of research on kind of policy and practice as a way of kind of evaluating the impact of that research. and outputs, the university, the institution has committed to say that research outputs will be evaluated on their intrinsic merit and not solely on metrics such as the title or the impact factor of the journal. Just finally, choosing and using metrics responsibly. So to summarise kind of what it is that I've been talking about, and just a few kind of checklists here. Use metrics alongside your knowledge. So alongside your expert assessment, your knowledge of that author or that article, read the article, knowledge of the journal, then who's on the editorial board, the aims and scope of the journal, etc. Ensure that you focus on the merit of the research output, not the publication venue. Use metrics relating to an individual output, so the article, not relating to the venue of the publication or the author. Use metrics consistently, so never mix and match metrics from different providers kind of in the same statement, and kind of related to that, be clear and transparent in the kind of the methodology that's being used in order to kind of compile those metrics, and think about the implication of that on who may be presented in a kind of a better light because of that methodology. Compare like with like, so make sure that you are using any, especially any kind of author related metrics, that you are comparing like with like, and not using it to compare a very established researcher with an early career researcher. Consider the value and impact of all research outputs, so as we mentioned kind of a minute ago. And then finally, consider a broader range of impacts as well. So not just the kind of application metrics, but the influence that research has had on policy, who the author collaborates with, etc. Thank you very much for listening.
Did you want to take questions for that part?
I think so.
Yeah, because mine's a bit broader, so I'm happy with more questions.
Any questions?
Yeah, I did about, so when you're talking about metrics, there's these three kind of main people that happen, so you Scopus, Web of Science and Google Scholar.
Yeah.
And I'm just wondering about who sort of owns them. I mean, I know who owns Google, but where do Scopus and Web of Science come from? Are they an amalgamation of journals, or are they from a university? Or?
So Scopus is owned by Elsevier.
Elsevier.
So these are large publishers,
Yeah,
who kind of aggregate content from other kind of publishers. They pull that together based on kind of selection criteria that they will have for their particular, so for what they will include on there. So Elsevier and Scopus is owned by Elsevier. Web of Science is owned by Clarivate. So they are very, very large kind of publishers. They will use, so they will both use the journal impact factor as their way of deciding what content is going to be kind of made available on their kind of index and kind of made available on their platforms. There are, if you look at, there's some kind of diagrams that will show the kind of overlap between those different kind of databases. So there will be some content that will be uniquely available on Web of Science, some content that will be uniquely available on Scopus, and there will be a whole lot of content that is not indexed on either of those platforms.
Is there sort of, it's not exactly a conflict of interest, but it's in their best interests to rank, so Scopus to rank Elsevier papers, or to give them more prominence? How do they avoid doing that?
It's not ranked, so it's ranking journals. So some of those journals will be published by Elsevier. Some of them will be published by other kind of learned societies or other kind of publishers. Yeah. As well.
But they might have like an unconscious bias towards their own journals in their methodology, maybe.
Yeah, I would very much agree with that statement. I think there is a kind of inherent problem when you have complete commercial monopolies owning what is essentially an aggregation of scholarly output, but it is also something that they use to kind of game the system in order that these metrics gain certain traction. So absolutely, so that's why we kind of advise such healthy scrutiny whenever you're using quote unquote these metrics at all, because the larger aggregating platforms are owned by, as you'd imagine, large commercial interests who do have a very vested interest in how these things are used. The general impact factor is the one that we kind of, as perhaps a longer history, I think, and so we can see why the use of that as a byword for quality is fraud. So yes, absolutely take the point, and I think it kind of is a through line in what Maggie was saying, that always ask an extra question before you use the number, right? Nothing was the old adage that not everything that can be counted counts, not everything counts can be counted, and I think that's very kind of appropriate for
Put
that.
that in there.
I figured it's
And it's also that it was supposed to be a measure index and it became a target for the researchers, therefore it's not fitting the purpose anymore.
Right, yeah.
And I think the H index is a fairly simple kind of rubric by which you could say, oh, someone's got a H index, meaning they're worth paying attention to. It's something that was debunked so thoroughly, and there are various different lists. Every time you compile a list or a new way of measuring something, someone else will eventually point out that that is compromised in some way. And the larger these data sets become, it's only the people with the resource to be able to evaluate those at speed using certain technologies that are able to gain the same advantage. And invariably, they are the people who have money. And so sometimes there is, like you say, not quite conflict of interest, but I mean, you could call it that. I'm aware of being recorded though, so.
Yeah, just thinking about some of that data you showed, and it showed that the Google Scholar had far more citations for that one article. I know that's just taking one of them. Google Scholar had far more citations listed for it, but then Google Scholar also doesn't index these smaller journals, as you said. So, like, it seems like they have a broader net, but with a broader net with larger holes in it.
Yes, and I think that sometimes the Google Scholar one as well, I've kind of read that there may be duplication kind of within there. So that can be, yes, it's difficult, I think, to disambiguate that kind of data. But they also, Google Scholar will include citations in books, which some of these other sources may well not be doing. Yeah, I mean, I put it in there to kind of to illustrate that idea. If you take a number kind of just out of kind of context, then it's not helpful.
Yeah, I tend to use Google Scholar because it's easy and I've got a plugin in my browser to do it.
Yeah,
but I can understand there being duplications. If you look at my references library, it's full of duplications I can't bother to go in and get rid of.
Yeah.
So trying to do that for every paper in the world is
It's
going to be
difficult.
difficult.
Yeah, but again, I think there are kind of political interests involved. For example, when we teach a longer open access session, it's about where you go to find some content. And there are whole databases dedicated to gathering and aggregating research from different parts of the world that are used in those parts of the world that aren't necessarily indexed completely by Google Scholar. So there's a database called Cielo for South American, primarily research produced by authors who affiliate with South American institutions. That isn't really crawled by the bots or whatever tech term is. So huge, vast resources of information that these systems aren't using, and one could argue that there is a political aspect of that non-use. Should I
Okay.
jump up?
We can continue.
So I'm going to talk about open access publishing more broadly, and again, is that coming from the next room? Or
That's
I'll project. Hopefully, people at home can hear me. So, given all that we've just mentioned and the level of detail that Maggie's gone into, I'm going to focus more on how you might publish openly. We will cover some of those same concerns, no doubt, because the same players are involved. But basically, normally I'd ask for a show of hands to see, like, how familiar are you with the concept of open access publication? Is it something that, for the people in the room, you've heard of before, you have your kind of general awareness of? But don't need to spend too much time on this slide. But essentially, the kind of traditional publishing model that most people understand, and everything in the academy, quote unquote, is exactly the same for open access publication. It's just the end result is that your work is openly available in ways that it wasn't before. There are many, many benefits. There are also risks, but I'm going to focus more on the benefits because we think generally openness is a good thing. The institution, research funders, government agencies, all the people that kind of control this sphere do believe in openness and open research. Open access publication has kind of morphed into open research now, a broader term to encompass various different methodologies, practices, all of which we can certainly incorporate into our discussion, but we're going to focus very much on publication now, because it's perhaps easiest to understand. And all the data that Maggie showed you in her slides there comes at the end of the journey. I'm going to talk about more from the beginning, essentially. And so, for example, the higher citation rates, obviously we've seen that that doesn't always mean what it's supposed to mean, as it were. There is something called the open access citation advantage, which is basically quite a simple rule that says if your work is openly available to absolutely everybody who's got access to the internet, chances are you will be cited more highly because more people can access it. In contradistinction to what was the traditional publishing model, where not everybody will be able to access your paper, say, because it might be behind a paywall, because it's a subscription journal that your library or your institution doesn't subscribe to, or more importantly, can't afford to subscribe to. So money comes into this quite a lot, and we will cover that from a distance. But all the other benefits are perhaps more worth focusing on. So practitioners can apply your findings. There's more exposure more generally for your work. So the kind of the open ecosphere that we imagine seeks to kind of address some of the imbalances that again Maggie talked about the figures. The public can access your findings either directly or indirectly. The public has some sort of way, in some sort of way, contributing to your doing your research, either at an institution, functions as a charity, etc. And so it's only fair that they get access to the outputs of scholarly research, we think. Compliance with grant rules is less exciting, but also very important. And we include in that things like REF. I mentioned REF too early on, but it's a big thing in Research Excellence Framework, for those of you who are not acronym savvy. It means that basically all funders are really kind of pushing the open agenda because they finally realize that some of the more traditional models of publishing are focusing profits in places that perhaps the academy wouldn't be happy. Taxpayers get paid for money, but more importantly, I think researchers in quote unquote developing countries, this isn't our slide, I'm reusing it, can access your work. So the kind of the global network research enterprise is greatly enhanced, we think, by open access publication. There's counter arguments now with the advent of generative AI and how everything be open comes with certain risks or mitigations. That is true, but it was true before, and it'll be true regardless of where you publish. Would be something I would contain. When we're talking about outputs, for the most part, we're talking about journal articles and conference proceedings because they are the so-called bread and butter of research publication. But this really applies to every given kind of output. I think in terms of books, it's a little bit behind. So open access publication for books is lagging, more to do with the time it takes to write the book, the kind of collaborative nature of the publication endeavor. The research data is definitely getting a focus more and more because people produce it, and the definitions of research data have been expanded so greatly in the last few years that, especially if you are funded, your funder will probably have a mandate for you to make certain outputs of your research available. But research data, we have our own data repository as well as a publications repository. Software, code, all the rest of it are kind of years ahead in terms of this. People have been sharing things openly in open software communities for much longer than publications. So again, that's something we look to. But for the most part today, we'll talk about journal articles just because it's simple. And so when open access was first kind of introduced in the 90s, I think it was kind of color coded. I don't know why, and I've never been able to find out, or I haven't had time to find out. But essentially, for simplification here, there are a few different models that we'll talk about. So gold open access is when the version of your work that's published on the publisher's site is openly available with a license for reuse. That sometimes involves a cost or a charge. If it's an article, it's the article processing charge. So if you hear APC, that's what that means. It's the kind of transactional value of that thing being made open and pay the publisher to make it open. Green is where you would publish in the traditional model, where your work might be behind a paywall, it might be a subscription-only journal, but you give us, the lovely team in the library's repository, the accepted version of your work. So when you submit, it's accepted for publication. That version of your work, before you sign over rights, is yours to do with what you wish. And so we ask them to deposit it on Elements, the university's information system. And that's called green open access or self-archiving. So a version of your work will be made open on the repository, but it will be closed or labeled on the publisher side. And then Diamond is the best of both worlds, which is a new model that is gathering much more support these days, where it's kind of crowd-funded or funded by institutions or consortia, where basically it's free for authors to publish their work open access on the publisher's site. It's free for readers to read that, obviously, because it's open. And the money doesn't go, it's not kind of based at the paper level. So there isn't an APC for it. It's, for example, we fund the Open Library of Humanities, particularly with discipline example here, but it's one of the ones that's a good model. We pay them £1,000 a year, and all content is open. Everyone can publish for free. Everyone can read it for free. £1,000 a year might sound like a lot until I describe some of the article processing charges that we also allow people to use. And so gold, I will only talk about gold because it's the one we're asked about most. I think green or diamond to some extent is the most attractive because it doesn't cost an arm and a leg, it doesn't cost the institution as much money as it throws at it. But gold is really what people want because they want to be able to publish in the journal that they know. And why they know that, maybe because they've been told by their peers or their supervisors when they're doing their doctorate, that that's the place to publish. And everyone will have their reasons for that. And we don't seek to influence where people publish. And so as a consequence, we've had to kind of apportion a large amount of the library's budget towards supporting gold open access publication. So we have publisher agreements with almost all the major houses and lots of smaller ones. We seek to try and arrange agreements with the smaller or mid-sized publishers as well. Again, cognizant of the fact that lots of our money goes to the same 5 commercial entities. Fund of block grants. So if you're funded by any of the UK research councils or the Open Trust, they give us pots of money every year to support their open access policies because they require that their authors, if you're acknowledging the funding, make the work open. And again, that applies to research data and other aspects as well. And then we have a small but very well used PGR fund for doctoral researchers that want to publish perhaps their first article, open access. There's criteria attached to that. Then there has to be a gold-only open access journal, kind of a mix of both, and you have to be first or corresponding author. Again, the main takeaway today will be get in touch. This is obviously for the Sussex authors in the room. I know there are maybe others on YouTube, but get in touch with us if you have any questions about that. But the main thing to remember for Sussex authors is if you're planning to publish gold open access and you can see by negotiations with the publisher that there is a charge involved, please get in touch with us first because we don't want you to end up with a huge bill. And when I say a huge bill, what I'm talking about is if you wanted to publish in a Spring and Nature journal, for example, we have a deal with them. So you should be covered, but if you didn't follow the regulations, you might end up with a 10.5 grand bill for one single paper. People use that number because it's shocking. I think it is shocking. It's going upwards, right? They're charging more. So please do check with us before submitting. In terms of green, so the open access, so we have Elements, which is our research information system, which you probably have heard about at Sussex. We encourage people to add their publications there. They populate your profile, and you can do the kind of the self-promotion that we advise. It's linked to Figshare, our repository, where we keep the versions of your work. It's building a kind of corpus of the university's research. So green open access is where you deposit the author's accepted manuscript to us. We get it and we make it available on the repository. Sometimes it might be closed at the publisher's site, sometimes it might be open, but essentially there is a version of that paper that is openly available. So people come to Sussex looking for Sussex research, they can find it easily. We have a policy in place from October last year that means you can publish where you want and we can still make a version of your work openly available. What happened before was that we would have to check with the publisher where you were publishing and they would say, yeah, you can make it open after 24 months. And this was to protect revenue streams so that the library would then buy subscriptions to that journal so people could access it. There are about 25 institutions across the UK now who've got these policies in place and they seek to push back against publishers telling us what our researchers can do with their own work. And so it's a way of kind of retaining your rights, also making the work openly available. You can opt out if you wish, we give you that option. But it just means that you're given freedom to publish where you want, so we don't seek to influence that, but we can also meet the kind of institution's objective to make its work open. So deposit for compliance, act on acceptance and deposit your work. And again, we're happy to take any questions. For the avoidance of doubt, this diagram shows you what the accepted manuscript is, because people often like, well, what version is that? I don't really get it. It's essentially before you signed the contract. So what happens is you go through this stage, peer review takes a while, again, completely kind of done for free by your colleagues. It's accepted by the publisher, and here is where you might sign something, more likely now just check something on the submission system. What you're doing there is you're signing away your copyright for the most part. And so the publisher owns the copyright for that work. You, as the intellectual property owner, do not anymore. And it means that they get to do with it what they will and you don't. Our policy functions around this area, so as long as you give us the deposited work here, doesn't matter what happens over here. So it's kind of like a slightly sneaky, but I think something that lots of institutions are doing to address a well-embedded problem. There's REF, I won't touch on it too much. There's a REF open access policy out for consultation now. Obviously, if you all to look at our web pages and see if you've got any strong thoughts on it, but essentially the same policy applies. If you're not concerned, if you're interested in having your work submittable for the Research Excellence Framework, it has to meet the open access policy, which is to deposit it within 3 months of the date of acceptance. And again, we've got a whole team who can advise on that. If you have any questions about that, we're happy to take it. It's in flux now, but it means that essentially it's aimed at making UK produced research openly available in line with the wider kind of move towards openness. If you publish gold open access via the publisher agreements we have, or via the block grants, chances are you'll be compliant with that policy. So again, that's a useful route to go. Licenses and reuse is a bit more granular in terms of detail, but again, happy to take questions on that. For now, you don't have to choose a specific license, but there are concerns around the next policy. And just remember that you always have options. Again, for those of you at Sussex, you can always get in touch with us and we can advise on which route is most appropriate for your work. Like I say, green, we have you covered by virtue of the institutional policy. Gold, as long as you're a corresponding author and you're publishing with one of the publishers with which we have an agreement, we should have you covered. And again, yeah, it means that your work can be made openly available to everybody. I think that's it, apart from the fact that we are always here to help and available for all kinds of consultation. I think that's it from me. So I'll leave that there. Any questions?
Well, because I've been told that as ECRs, often like we want to publish maybe works from our previous contracts when we are employed by another university, but therefore we don't necessarily have the funds ourselves to pay the APC for journals. And I've been told that maybe I could add the library for journals that where I don't have to pay the APC, so I could publish my own research.
So the way the agreements work, sorry, so if I understand you that in terms of your eligibility for use of our agreements or for. Yeah, no, I mean, essentially, each publisher has their own rules as to how our researchers can use the agreements. And that's the kind of the boring bit that's best done one-on-one with the person, so we can make sure that they've got everything's covered. But for the most part, if you are corresponding on an author on a publication, and it's listed in one of those agreements, your affiliation to Sussex is all you need. Really, and we can evidence that from you by virtue of you being contractually employed here or being on the central systems. And so, again, you can make healthy use of those agreements. We'll make sure that you are in fact covered. Moving between institutions is an interesting one because lots of you would go where the contracts are, right? And especially when you're in ECR, it's very much to do with where you were when. But again, we can check that, and really we can. There's a certain amount of flexibility we have. They ask us for information. They ask the library team for information about a researcher, and we can say, yes, they were employed here at this time, or we can be vague about it. And it's the truth of it, because they game it in the same way. There are certain publishers that introduce something called the registered corresponding author. So not only do you have to be the corresponding author on the paper, you now have to achieve another form of tick box exercise. And it was like, what's that? No one asked about that. And it's just this kind of, yeah, they want to protect revenue, which is fine, with commercial entities, I understand that, but also it's a bit messy, and they make it a bit messy, and we're the ones who have to tidy it up a lot of the time. So we're happy to do that on your behalf and navigate all of that mess for you, because it should be seamless. It should be that we've given them X amount of money so that our researchers can publish open access for free, and sometimes it's not, and we take on that administrative burden in the team, so that it should be hopefully straightforward for you.
And are there rules about this affiliation thing? Because I've also published a manuscript while I was in another university, but mentioning my previous university, because my PI asked me to.
I mean, in terms of, it depends what kind of publication it was and where you published, I suppose. I think the system recognizes that people move around a lot, but unless there's that cost involved, unless there's that APC, then that's really like, it didn't matter before, I don't think. your affiliation, you might want it changed on the paper as when it's published. But in terms of eligibility for use of these agreements, it didn't matter until this cost was introduced. So again, yeah, just check this. And it's only been rare that we've ended up with people coming to us with an invoice and saying, I got this, I thought it was paid by you. And then we checked the list and it wasn't on the list of journals that were included, or it's been taken out of the list, and then they had to try and find that money from their department. And it's a lot of money, and it's like yearly salary for like some part-time virtual contract. So yeah.
I was kind of interested in like the way kind of gold and green work together. So both of them, you end up with a freely accessible version of the paper that anyone on the internet can access. When I'm looking for a paper, I'll usually just go by the DOI. That will take me to the publisher's website, and if I can't get it through Sussex on there, or if I'm at home or whatever, I'll just go, all right, can't bother. I won't then search the university name and the authors of it and try and find it on the university website, because that seems like I don't know, unless it's a paper I really desperately need for something, I won't then follow the trail back through. But I see that green is much better, because then the university doesn't have to spend loads of money, you know, for the gold thing, giving it to the publisher, so that where you follow the DOI link, it's just freely available there. So like, how do we get more people to discover it on the university's portal, or any university's portal, rather than everyone having to go through this, through the gold method, which is costing them an absolute arm and a leg?
It's a very good question. It's something that the institutional repositories and universities have been grappling with for a long time. So in terms of the way that researchers search for papers, it's not just the Google search, right? And that's been kind of slowly shrunk into that kind of method. Search engine optimization favors the publishers.
Yeah.
The minting of DOIs, for example, there are different forms of persistent identifier. So you've got DOI atlas stages, for example, and the version of the paper that we make available has got some kind of handle, which is a different kind of identifier, both of which you can just whack into any search engine and find it. But obviously, you wouldn't know that necessarily, because you find the DOI by searching the paper type. So again, those aggregation databases do their work, and you might come across a Scopus record owned by Elsevier for an Elsevier journal, and there's a free version over here that you can't find. So again, you have to work against these huge corporate interests. There are aggregated databases like CORE, CORE, which aggregate institutional repository content.
Okay.
The more that the big players own software that powers institutional repositories, the more of these things get bumped up a list of results. I would suggest, in terms of searching, you can just literally add the word repository out of the paper title and get to it. But you know, with your researchers, you know how to find things, so that's not a problem. I understand there's a kind of systemic problem. It's one that's very, very difficult to fight against. The green movement is really more about ensuring that there is open content, and not necessarily just for people looking for a single paper. Given the way that things are found now, text and data mining, you know, having open research at scale is also important. So the institution to support it. So yeah, it's not really, there's no easy answer to that. Actually, it's still difficult to find, and the more that people just use search engines quickly, they will invariably be tempted with the ones that might be.
Yeah. Because they're amazing.
Well, that's the thing.
It is. So it's like you're just sort of clicking through and you've got 2 million tabs open.
Absolutely,
I want to get 1 sentence.
Yes, and we're very, very mindful of that. It's just that we try and push it away. But when you get to that paper, it might not look the same. There will be accepted versions, so it doesn't have the bells and whistles of the published, or the version of records. And so you might feel less comfortable citing it, for example. You might think, well, this is just a Word document that I don't understand. And we have to go around and say, no, we've done proper checks and balances. This is exactly the same as that. It's just that you take time.
And is there sometimes a problem with these repositories whereby, well, if you had a retraction or a application or something like that in a paper that might not locate to the actual publisher itself, and quite quick to do that, since their reputation, can there be a lag with the green repositories where maybe that data doesn't get picked up as quickly as they want?
It is, yeah, it's tricky because the way that those two things are linked, essentially the publishing version and the repository version, is it will have a list of the DOI on the records, and then sites like attraction watch that Maggie mentioned, and generate reports, and sometimes it's a very manual process that gets quite through. But I'm sure that there will be versions of retracted papers available on the repositories. But the publishers, when you say they're quick to act, not always, and not even when they've been told to a lot of the time. And again, you're talking about scale a lot of the time. And the retraction watch to the report last year, and the graph goes like up like that to 2020, and then like that in terms of the number of papers retracted that they've been able to track. And even that was a very small percentage. And that's because of things like paper nodes and kind of the fraudulent scale essentially. So even though they might be more difficult to find, there is quality control in repositories that you don't necessarily get elsewhere.
Well, it's like that core.
Yeah.
I like the idea of an aggregator for all the different repositories that is super useful.
Its search functionality isn't quite as,
That's the
as
thing, yeah,
good,
it's not
but
gonna be as good as.
yeah, so you're compromising slightly on the search functionality, but
Yeah.
it's good because it is harvesting content from repositories globally. So, yeah.
Thank you.
Mikhail is in the chat is saying that for finding open access versions, you can add the unpayable browser plugin, which will also show you if there are open versions available and link directly to it.
Yeah, or there's the open access button. So there's an unpayable extension you can put in your browser, or there's one called open access button.
That's an extension for it. Sure.
Yeah, that's a good point.
We're trialing something with Linky at the moment, which essentially is a version of the browser plugin that might also be able to look for particular versions, so the ones that run repositories. So it's early days. I think the hope is that you have a button that essentially does one click and everything, so you can't find the publishing version. Library doesn't have subscriptions, or data that prompts you to. In that instance, the handle record.
Yeah, I think you have to make these things easy to use.
Yeah.
Because people's time is quite, it's quite limited. So if it was just one button on a browser, yeah, actually, I might click that before I think about giving up. And I know that makes me sound really, really lazy.
No, I mean, if there's one thing we're mindful of is that no one's got time.
Yeah.
Absolutely, no one's got time. It's try and make this thing easier, and then that's why it's it's easy to go. Oh, I can publish code there, and it's even.
Yeah, that's why the goal is like attractive for people like myself who publish, because then I know that people won't be put off at looking at it, right? Because they just go to where the DOI is, and that's
Mikhail was also hi Mikhail. My office. It's worth noting the new player on the field. I think when we were talking about Google Scholar, which is offering an alternative, OpenAlex, which is now the largest database except for Google Scholar, and it is open source and run by a non-profit.
sounds good. Yeah.
OpenAlex.
OpenAlex.
Regarding the metrics, like, of course, the question is like, why are we still using them? And
Yeah.
and who does it benefit? And I guess it benefits people who are to select people for promotions or for jobs and things like that, because it makes their job easier, I guess. But it's not, because the DORA is saying that the criteria should be very clear when it comes to this type of thing.
Yeah.
And it doesn't appeal to me that it's very clear.
Very true. Yes, I know that there's DORA. There's lots of different statements or initiatives that point towards research culture and reform of research assessment, and they're all very grand claiming, but they use phrases like intrinsic merit. So you measure the research on its intrinsic merit, and then you ask them, well, what's intrinsic merit? There's no way on scale to account for that, because it varies so vastly between different things. So it always comes down to kind of using your gut in a way, isn't it? It's a bit strange, which isn't possible. So we're signatories to DORA, and in terms of research assessment and how we might move away from using metrics, for example, for promotion criteria, what we'd ideally like to see is to have, contributions to the open research environment at your institution as a part of any kind of evaluation that a panel might do, or, practice in publishing openly. Somebody suggested that something, it was a ref panel thing, saying, don't score the paper about where it's published. Well, no, you can score it where it's published, but only if that publisher is mission aligned. So not that you get a 4-star paper in ref because you published in the highest prestige journal in the field, you get a 4-star ref score because you published somewhere that was seeking to change the balance. And it was radical, and all the librarians were like, yeah, fantastic, and all the researchers were like, that's just not possible, it's ridiculous. But any kind of slow kind of gradation towards that, I think would be good, because like you say, there's no, the reason these measurements still exist is because there isn't an alternative that can apply at the same scale, I think. I don't know.
Yeah, no, I was quite disappointed. So this in the last week, I only learned about the DH index last week because of something that the university had put on our staff website, drawing attention to the work of a particular member of staff because of how they were ranked within this DH index. So then I was like, oh, so where does that fit with? So we're kind of elevating people and promoting and kind of talking about them based on a kind of numerical metric ranking. And that was like, oh, I haven't heard of this one.
Yeah.
So
At the
I
same
think
time,
it's-
there's work going on in the institution to
To-
really try
to
and
try and
change the
change
research
it,
culture, to move away from that.
Yeah,
But because of the aforementioned time restrictions, no one's got time
yeah.
to do it all. And so we had different people working at loggerheads essentially across the same space, which is bizarre, but it's happening everywhere.
Yeah.
So also, it's a good thing because I guess people are trying to find alternatives, but now there are so many of them that who is actually using the alternative?
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I suppose it's that building up that whole picture, isn't it? So there's a space for the numerical kind of value, but then there's also that space for understand, kind of presenting that other kind of picture about that particular author or that particular kind of article. And it's about kind of using that as a phrase basket of metrics, and not just picking kind of one, but using a range to demonstrate your particular individual kind of impact.
And so I'm curious how the library is using those metrics, because I know us as researchers for job applications, we need them. Funders, I guess, need them. The university might need them for like recognition, I don't know.
So the only way that we're also on our repository, we have the altmetric donuts. So if you look at anything on Elements, any publications on Elements, they have the altmetric donuts, and then they also have a number of citations listed as well, don't they?
Yes.
But I mean, I suppose the one way we use them is that we run courses encouraging people to think about what is the kind of the context, how is that metric being derived, and what is the most appropriate or not kind of use for it.
And I've seen in other universities that researchers can contact their libraries for the library people to help them with those metrics when they are applying for jobs. Is that something that here at Sussex?
It's not a service we've offered so far because I suppose of it's not very straightforward, and that people might want to use them in ways that we don't necessarily think are appropriate.
Yeah, but
It's
that
difficult,
could be
but
a way to like.
it's
they
true,
can-
yeah, absolutely, yeah. I got promotion criteria, for example, is something that the research culture team over in RQI are looking at, and yeah, it's always useful to feed these things back. So I certainly will. Yeah, it's given how complicated it gets very quickly. I'm not sure how we would devise a service around that would be useful to people, to be honest.
Well, I guess it would be a
One-on-one, yeah, conversation. Yeah.
Okay.
Thinking about how people like use these metrics, it's often quite informative. So I'm not going to write a paper and say I'm citing this particular paper in my paper because it's in a journal. You know, I wouldn't say what the journal impact actually is anywhere in the text of the paper, but I might informally just look up this kind of stuff out of interest, like I might look up an author's like H score, or if I'm trying to decide which of the 3 journals I need to apply to, I might look up their journal impact factor and then prefer one over the other. But that's not ever actually written down anywhere where I'm using that. And I think what you said about promotion criteria, people might, like employers might not say that, but they might informally look up people and just rank them because they used to do that. Even if you told them they couldn't look up someone's H score, and well, they couldn't officially use that to rank candidates, they might do that anyway, because that's the kind of thing that they used to look up. And if it's not actually, like if it's done informally like that, how do you know, you don't know that.
We don't know it's happening, do you? Yeah.
So what impact does it have that isn't measured in any, or measured and reported at all? It's, well, no, it's impossible to know, but I have a feeling it's quite high.
Yes. It's amazing how we still get, when we're forwarded on queries from researchers, we might scroll through a thread, and right at the bottom there will be some advice from one of the senior researchers, these lab or something like that, saying, "Oh no, it's really good because it's got a journal impact factor or so and so." And no, how do we go all the way back to the beginning? Because it's not necessarily our place. They will have all kinds of information that is kind of in that statement, like you say, that is, or you can just assume that that's been communicated between people in certain spaces, and it's, we see it more than we'd like, we understand it. And again, the kind of notion of prestige is something that the open access movement sought to kind of move away from, as does DORA and research cultural assessment reform. But those notions of prestige are very much baked into the system, and you know, everyone in your respective field will probably know where would be the best place for you to publish to advance your career, right? And that's probably going to be with one of the top 5 publishers that university. And if it isn't, it will probably be owned by them in the next year because they move them up, right? So we're very, very mindful of that, and the pressures to advance in your career are so great in this current situation we find ourselves in. That's why we offer gold open access publisher agreements with them, right? You know, it would be nice. There's been talk of walking away from commercial publishers over the last 3 or 4 years. Some institutions in Northern Europe did it. University of California did it. They also did it. You know, it was a negotiation tactic to broker a better deal because their researchers were up in arms. It was like, what do you mean I can't publish with there? That's going to make or break X, Y, Z.
And people may have principles, but they also have.
Yes, exactly. And so it's that balance.
Do you want to be the person that sticks their neck? Not everyone is willing to do that.
Not especially as an early career researcher.
No, exactly.
Perhaps you're more likely to do that when you're established, you know.
Yeah, but then it's a feedback loop, because when you're a senior researcher, you're publishing the work of early career researchers.
Yeah, true. Well, if your PI came and said to you, no, you can't publish in or whatever, you have to publish in this open access journals, it's important to me. And you would feel pressured to do that because it's your supervisor, and that might not be best for you. It's tough.
What's the engagement of open access here? Like how much of Sussex research is open access?
It's gone up a lot. So I was in a position from 2020, and we had one deal with Springer, and we sort of, a couple of 100 papers published through that, I suppose. But then we had versions open in the repository, just slightly more formalized way. And now we've got 22 agreements, all of which are very, very heavily used. So I imagine there's probably, I don't know the hard numbers because we don't want to start counting things like that because then that number gets used in my. But I would say at least 30 to 40% increase in terms of the amount of gold open access publication that's been made available, which is good because that does represent some sort of return on investment, because the investment is sizable. It's kind of like hundreds of thousands of pounds of library budget that we're putting towards this. So if not more. So it is good, and they are good. They achieve something, but they're called transitional agreements in the open access landscape because they're only supposed to be lasting for about 3 or 4 years. Because then all the journals in these agreements should move to open access as the business model for them and not from subscription. But they're all dragging their feet. They're all taking a very, very long time because while these big deals go on, they can continue to charge huge amounts of money for them. So there's no vested interest in moving towards. And even when they do, it's on the APC model, which means here's a paper, this is how much we charge for it, make it open, and they can still uptick that price as much as they want. And then you end up with somebody who is an ECR, who needs to publish there and needs to find that money. And that's where our kind of green policy considers backstop.
I can say, what about since October, do you have any idea how much in addition has been made available via the repository because of the rights? Change.
Yes, it's difficult to gauge because you have to then go and check every published policy, but Beth and I were giving a talk the other day and I did have the figure, but I didn't want to share it because what the figure that made the most impact was how much we've saved. And that kind of transactional value of a research paper is something that we want to move away from. The best way to talk about it is we've got policy, so we'll make it open, and open is what the university wants and what's good for the ecosphere. It was about 50 odd papers since October that have been made openly available with an open license that wouldn't have been prior.
That's brilliant.
And if you times that by an average APC, you get another figure, but it's the kind of the shop that goes, oh wow, fantastic, X £1,000, brilliant. Whereas just 50 papers that were open and they would have been, I think is also great.
Yeah.
Very short space of time. And that will move on. It's then how you apply that same kind of groundswell to different forms of output. I mean, I don't know what it's like in your guys' discipline. Do you use like preprint servers and stuff? Do you post early versions of your work? How do you share information at early stages? Would you not? Yeah,
Not so
it's more
much.
prevalent in engineering. So on hard sciences, like physicists do it. Like from day one, I think, but it varies across.
That's to stop kind of getting scooped, like some of the free stuff.
Sometimes, yeah.
But the things that, the area I work in engineering, it's not really a case of getting everything's. So we just wouldn't do that. We'd be more likely in that case to give someone else some ideas to catch up with us, rather than protecting, because we're not dealing with fundamental things, we're dealing with applications of something. So, people might not afford to do. I think there's definitely a less of that in engineering than it's in the better services.
Well, in biology, there was definitely, depending on your field, I'm working with pollinators, and you can imagine that many people are working on pollinators.
Yeah.
It's kind of a race, publishing the results before.
So would you share a research paper via a preprint?
I'm personally not really good at that, but yes, the culture is more.
The culture is
Yeah, because
yeah.
it's time constraint or any adverse reaction to it. Do you not want
No,
to
I
really
think it's
understand?
great. But there is also a bit of perfectionism, like you don't want to put out something you still
Yeah.
could take negative feedback. That's if ever someone reads it, but I've been encouraged by here at Sussex for promotions and things like that to presence, so they would be included in my paper.
Okay.
Why not? Just like never done it before, see what it's like. I'll ask pleasure.
Yeah, it's worth exploring. I think we're hoping to run a session in Summit Research in June about preprints and open peer review and kind of opening up in those early stages of work where it's more as a kind of collaborative tool. Appreciate that if you're developing an idea that is almost finished, right, and is always going to make it. And it's because we're very much focused on the publication side of things. We don't see an awful lot of situations we've got to take in. But the finished object, the publishable paper, is something that we hear about a lot. People want to protect that idea so that they can publish it in journal X. So that, and the idea is to switch to a more kind of open as embedded from the very beginning. And it like I say, it varies across this. Something that's maybe worth exploring.
I'm not sure where I would find the time or the desire to open peer review someone else's work on one of these preprint platforms. Like, I know there isn't anything in for me actually reviewing papers either, because you don't get paid or recognised for that. But it seems like I would have even less motivation to open peer reviews as well.
But if you do closed peer review, nobody knows you're doing it. So there's no credit. If you did open peer review via one of these platforms, then is there not a little bit more of a, well, I'm getting credit and I'm getting recognition for that?
Peer review anyway. So I guess some of
Foreign
it-
assimilation.
Yeah.
Yeah, but for the most part, yeah.
But they might be worried about saying something stupid.
Oh, that's the thing, it comes at a cost, like, we, in the library, we talk about this stuff as if it's easy, but it's not, and then, like, people ask you about your working practice, you're like, oh, I'm not necessarily gonna tell you that, you know, it takes a while to get into the mindset of it, and there are so many other pressures that come to bear, so, yeah, absolutely, but I think it's, if contribution to open peer review is something that was useful in terms of promotion practice, it's not all about that.
Yeah.
If it was kind of institutionally and culturally,
Yeah,
then it might be
definitely.
more
If it was encouraged officially somehow,
Yeah.
then I think people would like only to go through research.
It can't come from us, like,
No,
No, of course not, yeah, but that's the thing, and that's why we talk to drapes and heads of school and all the rest of it, and try and get encouraged, but maybe it's just that it takes a long while, I think, because it's like traditional pressures.
they can quite easily write things. Do that, this is a good idea, just some official guidance saying this would be considered. If they talk about things like citizenship, which we all do quite a lot of, at least us anyway, because we're quite involved in this process, but you know, if there was a little official kind of do some open peer review stuff,
Yeah.
go, cool, like, I'll put aside 2 hours a week to do that. And probably learn a lot about it and enjoy it. It needs to be,
You need to get that kind of, yeah.
Needs to be incentivized, absolutely, and I think, like, really listening to VC talk about the new strategy, there was an open research strand that we were quite encouraged by, because it's kind of, that would seek to do something about that anyway, to make it more kind of formally recognised, and these practices to help gain a bit of traction. But again, it's what do you drop, right? There's only so much time you have. And if that is constantly squeezed, then these things are going to fall down.
Mikael again is commenting in the chat. I don't know what his refers to exactly, but at which point of our conversation, but he's saying, I think that's why it's an important decision to opt out of deals with the big four profit publishers, which are made on higher levels, for instance, Max Planck or the Swedish Research Council. And are there any talks about such a move across institutions or funders that you are aware of?
So we evaluate the agreements we have at the institution, but they are consortially evaluated by an organisation called JISC. And so that's like lots of UK universities who say, right, this is the deal, these are the players involved. Can we walk away from this? And these conversations have been going on a lot over the last 3 or 4 years. And it almost happened with Elsevier because their profit margins exceed those of Google, right? But the uproar that was posited from lots and lots of other institutions about what their researchers would do, because the reason these are so difficult to walk away from is not just the publishing, it's the reading. So they've combined reading and publishing into these deals. So it's not just that you publish for free, so we get access to all the older content that's behind subscriptions. And so you as researchers aren't able to access material you need to do your work because we've cancelled subscriptions. If you cancel a single subscription, you will get 5 emails from somebody who's never emailed you before saying this was vital to my work, because we've never known. Part of the benefit of that system, but it also means that then when you say, right, you can't read any of the work in any of the journals most quote unquote prestigious in your field on the basis of principle because we've given them too much money, people don't care. And so the idea is to push this message up and up and up and up, and that's why having something like open research in the university strategy is something that we can hang these conversations off, I think, and certainly seek to make more of a change. There's a current deal, I won't say which one, under evaluation now that we do intend to walk away from because of not even the money that we're spending, but the behaviour of the publisher and new things that they've introduced. They seek to charge for green open access, which has nothing to do with them. Right. But they're trying to charge for that. And so we're like, no, okay. Maybe we won't do that then. I've pretty much given away that publisher, I think, huge, but that's fine. They shouldn't have done it. So yes, there are talks about it. It's very difficult to get that happening again at sufficient level that real savings can be made. But people feed that message up all the time, and the library is most vocal there, I think.
That's interesting about it not being historical. If I couldn't access any Elsevier that was before 2023, that would make my research incredibly difficult.
Yeah.
So that's a huge kind of big chip, isn't it?
It was a slight and not a misstep, I suppose, it was under duress, but essentially the big deals that we used to have were subscription big deals. And so all of those journals were combined in a big Elsevier package, and they would say, here you go, pay us this massive fee or nothing. And you couldn't tease out the most appropriate journals and just pay for those. And so these big deals were like, became a problem because all the library's budget went to them. And then essentially those big deals have been recreated with the publishing aspect incorporated into them, which makes it even more difficult to walk away because open access publication is now a thing that funders require and that people want to do. So it's yeah, we've kind of tied our own hands behind our back a little bit there. At the UK research community, it's very difficult at institutional level to be able to make much of a difference other than walking away. So I'm more inclined to do that. I couldn't see how to do it all the time, but I will harangue people where I can.
And this is coming from a massively privileged country as well. Like imagine, I have loads of, well, especially in animal behavior life because we're global, and I have colleagues in Ireland which are not accessing any kind of papers. We were organizing the roundtable and I had to send them the papers because they didn't have access. So if it's affecting us, imagine how it's affecting the rest of the world.
Absolutely.
See if they're available on call.
Yeah, so is that cool then, Karen?
Yeah.
But again, when the Elsevier negotiation was going on and the proposed walkaway was talked about, the library community kind of mobilized into library loans mode. They were like, okay, well, we'll share individual articles. So when you can't access that because we've cancelled our subscriptions, but we can get it for you within 24 hours. And whether or not that's a kind of a balance that works for the individual researcher who needs it and doesn't cost us too much money. But it was amazing how quickly everyone was like, okay, yeah, we'll work together quickly to do that. And we have the technology now that we can do that. And it really helps negotiation with the bigger publishers. We can say, well, we could feasibly now cancel across the whole of one part of the country because we can get it this way. It's not quite there yet, but I'm hoping it's another kind of weapon in our arsenal. Make it sound like a battle like all publishers is bad. That's not what I'm saying. It's just that the bigger commercial entities aren't asking themselves these questions.
Well, I think it's a major point of like conflict in the publishing system. And it's an excellent bridging argument because I think our next roundtable will be about how to make publishing ethical. So I don't know if you've heard of Fernando Racimo, I think he published a paper on that. And it's part of the peer community in group. So he will be a panel at the roundtable.
Okay.
And I'm trying to invite other researchers that are like fairly involved in making publishing more ethical. That should happen around July, I think.
Okay. We're trying to get someone from the peer community in to talk at the event in June as well, because it's pre-registration of the peer community, and there's kind of different options available in terms of what you can do. Yeah, so that's good. They're great.
Michael, again, thanks, and interesting to hear. So the key issue is that we've been tricked and we're locked in. Are we institutionally or nationally investing in the infrastructure needed to avoid future lock-in?
Going big. Yes, so there's initiatives called International Open Infrastructure. I forget the exact acronym. So yes is the short answer, but less so in the UK than elsewhere. I think again Europe are a bit ahead of us. I think France even has a national mandate for openness via sort of green routes. The United States tried to do it recently with a kind of mandate for open research, but they excluded the kind of green focus, so it was a more kind of license to print money with the commercial publishers. But again, the movement towards that is good. It's just that at some point commercial interests become interested in it and then they seek to influence it. So in terms of like building infrastructure to avoid that kind of future lock-in is something that we can't really affect at this level, other than pass the message on about how bad it's gotten. And I think every time we give a very basic introduction to open access, like I've done there, or even a longer session, all the researchers in the room say, yeah, it's broken, it's a terrible system, it's an absolutely terrible system. And I remember being at a conference in Cambridge where somebody, wonderful speaker called Symes said, We need to publish less and more forcefully. And I thought it was a wonderful phrase in terms of the kind of this accretion of pace, like we talked about. It was a race to get your thing out there. The kind of increase in volume, numbers of publications become more important. All the metrics you have drives this kind of engine of profit making. And so instead, what would an alternative look like? There is a product called Octopus now, which seeks to break down the research lifecycle into the various different component parts. So it's not just about the paper at the end, because that is the narrative version of the research you've done. And it needn't be the be all and end all, I don't think. And so you kind of tease apart your process more and find different ways to make it open, or not. It doesn't always need to be, shouldn't be in some cases. Kind of devaluing, I suppose, the final narrative paper is something that we'd encourage all ECRs to think about, even though you're getting pressure from your people in your department to say you must publish here, publish there. So it's not really an answer to go, I'm sorry, but
Okay, if you don't have more questions, I think we can wrap up. So thank you for showing up. So another note. And thanks to everyone online. So you can find us on X, unfortunately. We have Mastodon, but our community is not as big on Mastodon yet. Our website at Animal Behavior Live, on Instagram, and now on Thread, I think. And so this video will be available as a replay on our YouTube channel. And as I said, the next event will probably be the roundtable in July, but we also have our annual conference in November. You're not working on animal behaviors. The roundtable, maybe the conference, I'm not so sure. All right.
Cool. Yeah, thank you very much.
Cheers.
Thank you.